At -96 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind had already decided Margaret Hale would not survive the night, and she knew it because her legs stopped feeling like they belonged to her long before she felt the snow swallowing her slowly, like it had been waiting for years for someone exactly this week, exactly this alone. And somewhere behind her something moved, not fast, not loud, just patient, watching her, breathing slow as if measuring the moment it would claim her. But when the wolf finally stepped out of the white, it did not attack. It circled once, twice, then stopped close enough for her fading eyes to see the frost clinging to its fur, and for a second she thought this was mercy in its cruelest form, until it did something no instinct could explain. It lowered its body against hers, sharing heat that should have been its own. Then suddenly it bit into her coat, dragging her across the ice as the storm grew worse, as distant howls answered back as if warning it to stop, but it didn't. And just when a cabin light flickered through the storm and hope felt real for the first time, the wolf turned back toward the darkness, bleeding and alone, and Margaret realized the story wasn't over, not even close. No one survives a night like this, not at -96 degrees Fahrenheit, not when the wind starts whispering your name like it already owns you. And Margaret Hale understood that long before her body finally slowed enough to listen, because the cold did not arrive all at once. It crept into her boots first, then her fingers, then her thoughts, until even fear felt distant, like something she used to remember instead of something she could still feel. And the horizon around her had already disappeared, swallowed by a white emptiness that erased direction, erased time, erased the idea that there had ever been a world beyond this frozen silence. And still she kept moving, not because she believed she would make it, but because stopping felt too much like agreeing with the cold that this was where her story ended. And the wind howled low across the open land, dragging snow in long endless waves that reshaped the ground with every passing second, as if the earth itself was trying to forget she was there. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion there was a quiet realization forming, not sudden, not dramatic, but slow and undeniable, that she had already crossed the invisible line between fighting to live and simply not knowing how to stop walking, even though each step grew smaller, weaker, less certain than the last. And when her foot finally slipped on the hardened ice beneath the powder, she didn't catch herself, she didn't even try, she just sank down into the snow, as if the ground had been waiting patiently for her to return. And for a moment there was nothing, no struggle, no panic, only the distant sound of wind pressing against the edges of her fading awareness, and the strange calm that comes when the body begins to let go of its arguments with the inevitable. And it was in that silence that something shifted, not in her but in the world around her, because the storm did not pause, the cold did not soften, and yet there was a presence now, something unseen, moving just beyond the reach of her dimming senses, something that did not belong to the wind or the snow or the endless white emptiness that surrounded her. And if she had been stronger, she might have turned, she might have noticed the faint pattern forming behind her steps, a second set of tracks appearing where none should exist. But Margaret Hale was no longer watching the world, she was slipping out of it, her breathing shallow, her eyes heavy, her body curling instinctively against the cold as if it could shield itself from something that had already found its way inside. And still that presence remained closer, now patient, deliberate, neither rushing nor retreating, as though it understood something she did not, that this moment mattered, that this fragile space between life and something quieter held a choice that had not yet been made. And the wind carried on, erasing everything behind her, while ahead there was nothing at all, only the unknown waiting silently as the storm closed in. And somewhere just beyond the veil of falling snow, a pair of eyes opened, steady, unblinking, not with hunger, not yet, but with something far more uncertain, as if even the wild itself had paused to consider what should happen next. The cold did not take Margaret Hale all at once, it unraveled her piece by piece, starting with memory, because as she lay there half buried beneath drifting snow, the world she had known began to slip away, not in dramatic flashes but in quiet fragments. A door left open, a voice, she could almost hear the faint outline of a place that no longer existed, and beneath it all one truth settled heavier than the storm above her: she had not simply gotten lost, she had been left behind. The realization did not come with anger or even sadness, it came with a hollow clarity, the kind that arrives when there is no strength left to argue against it, because somewhere miles away there had been people, there had been warmth, there had been a choice, and that choice had not included her. And now the land stretched endless and indifferent, as if it had always been this way, as if she had always been alone. And the wind pressed closer, carrying grains of ice that whispered across her coat like a voice repeating the same quiet message over and over until it no longer needed words. And still that presence remained, watching, waiting, unseen but no longer distant, because the tracks it left behind her began to close the space between them, step by step, measured, patient, deliberate, not the reckless movement of hunger but something slower, something that studied, that considered. And in the dim edge of her awareness Margaret felt it not as fear but as a shift in the silence itself, as though the storm had made room for something else to exist within it, and if she had opened her eyes she might have seen the faint shape forming through the white, a figure low to the ground, moving with a precision the wind could not erase, its fur dusted with frost, its breath steady against the freezing air. But she did not open her eyes, she sank deeper into the stillness, her body conserving what little warmth remained, curling inward as if retreating from a world that had already let her go, and yet the presence did not rush forward, it did not claim what lay before it. Instead it stopped just beyond reach, its gaze fixed not on what she was but on what she was becoming, something fragile, something fading, something caught between two states that even the wild rarely hesitated to resolve. And still it hesitated, and the wind howled louder as if urging it forward, as if reminding it of what should happen next. But instinct did not move it, not yet, because there was something in the way she lay there, something in the absence of struggle, in the quiet surrender that did not resemble prey but something else entirely, something unfamiliar. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the distance between them held suspended in a question that neither of them could answer. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the creature took one step closer, not to end what remained but to understand it, and the storm closed in tighter around them, swallowing sound, swallowing space, leaving only two figures within its endless white, one nearly gone and one no longer certain of what it had come to do. The wind shifted without warning, and for a brief moment the endless noise thinned into something quieter, something that allowed a different sound to exist beneath it, the slow, deliberate crunch of weight pressing into snow, closer now, closer than before. And still Margaret Hale did not move. Her body had already chosen stillness over resistance, her breath shallow, her form barely rising beneath the frost that gathered along her coat, as if the storm itself was beginning to claim her shape. And the presence that had been watching stepped into the space beside her, not suddenly, not with force, but with a caution that did not belong to hunger. Its head lowered, its ears angled, not forward in pursuit but slightly back, as if uncertain, as if something within it had paused, a pattern older than the storm, older than the land itself. And it studied her not as prey but as something unresolved, something that did not fit the rules written into bone and instinct, because she did not run, she did not fight, she did not even see. And the absence of those things created a silence between them that no wind could fill. And slowly the wolf moved closer, until the space between fur and fabric was no longer distance but presence, its breath visible in the freezing air, its warmth faint but real against the edge of her frozen sleeve. And still it did not act in the way it should have. Instead it circled once, then again, each step careful, deliberate, carving a shallow path around her as though tracing a boundary that had not existed moments before. And somewhere deep within Margaret there was the smallest flicker, not thought, not awareness, but something quieter, a sensation of not being entirely alone. And it lingered just long enough to change something subtle but irreversible in the space around them, because the wolf stopped circling and faced her again, its body tense not with aggression but with a conflict that had no name, a hesitation that stretched longer than instinct would allow, as the wind rose again, pressing against its fur, urging movement, urging decision, urging it back into the pattern that had always defined survival. And yet it remained, and then without warning it lowered itself to the ground beside her, not touching, not yet, but close enough that the barrier of cold between them began to weaken, the air shifting, the space changing in a way that should not have mattered but did. And Margaret's fingers, buried beneath layers of fabric, felt something faint, something that did not belong to the storm, a trace of warmth so small it could have been imagined. And still it grew as the wolf shifted again, closing the final distance until its body rested against hers, the contact light at first, then steady, then intentional. And the world did not change, the storm did not stop, the cold did not retreat, but within that small impossible space something else began, something that neither the wind nor the wilderness could explain. And far beyond the narrow circle where they lay, a distant sound carried through the storm, not loud, not immediate, but present, a low echo that did not belong to the wind alone. And the wolf's head lifted, its ears turning toward the darkness beyond the white, as if hearing something that had not yet arrived. And for the first time since it had stepped into her path, its stillness broke not into fear but into awareness of something larger, something approaching, something that would not wait for hesitation. And the fragile moment that had formed between them began to shift again toward something far more dangerous than the cold. The sound did not belong to the storm, and the wolf knew it before it fully reached them, because it carried a rhythm that wind could not create, a distant echo rising and falling with intention, with presence, with others. And its body stiffened not in fear but in recognition, as its ears turned sharply toward the horizon where the white blurred into something darker, something deeper. And Margaret Hale lay unmoving beside it, her breath thin and fragile, her warmth fading even as the wolf pressed closer, as if trying to hold something that was already slipping away. And the space between moments tightened as the distant sound grew clearer, not loud but certain, a signal carried through miles of frozen air. And the wolf shifted, its weight rising slowly from the snow, its body no longer still, no longer uncertain, because whatever approached was not a question, it was a force that would not hesitate. And it took a step away from Margaret, then stopped, its gaze returning to her form half buried in the drift, as If measuring something that could not be seen, weighing something that could not be understood within the simple language of survival, because leaving would be easier, leaving would follow every rule that had ever kept it alive, and yet it remained caught between motion and stillness as the wind pressed harder against its fur, urging decision, urging escape, urging distance from what was coming, and for a brief moment it turned away fully, its body angled toward the direction of the sound, ready to disappear into the storm as it had done countless times before. But it did not move forward, it did not run, instead it paused, and in that pause something changed, not in the world but within the narrow fragile space where instinct had always ruled without question. And the wolf looked back again, its eyes fixed on Margaret, not as prey, not as something to abandon, but as something unfinished, something that had not yet reached its end. And slowly, deliberately, it stepped back toward her, closing the distance it had just created as the sound in the distance grew stronger, closer, no longer just an echo but a presence that would soon arrive. And the wolf lowered its head, nudging at her sleeve, not forcefully but with a persistence that suggested urgency, a quiet demand that she move, that she rise, that she remain within the world just a little longer. And when she did not respond, when her body remained still against the snow, the wolf shifted again, gripping the edge of her coat, carefully pulling, testing resistance, as if learning in real time what it meant to carry something heavier than itself, heavier not in weight but in consequence. And the storm thickened around them, the wind erasing their outlines even as the moment sharpened into something irreversible. And the wolf pulled again, this time stronger, dragging her slightly across the frozen surface, leaving a faint trail that the snow began to cover almost instantly. And far behind them the shapes within the storm started to form, shadows within the white, moving closer with each passing second. And the wolf did not look back again, it did not wait, it pulled once more, committing fully to a path that had no place in the logic of the wild. As the distance between them and the approaching presence narrowed, and the fragile, impossible bond between a fading human and a creature of instinct transformed into something far more dangerous than the cold itself, because now there was not only the storm to survive but something else, something that would not hesitate to claim what the wolf had chosen, to protect. The weight of her body dragged against the frozen ground in uneven motions as the wolf pulled again and again, each movement slower than the last but more determined, as if something inside it had already crossed a line it could not return from. And Margaret Hale felt none of it, not the cold biting deeper into her bones, not the rough pull of fabric against ice, not even the shifting of the world beneath her as she was moved inch by inch away from where she had almost disappeared completely. And yet somewhere far beneath the surface of her fading awareness something stirred, not fully awake, not even conscious, but present, like a distant echo of warmth that refused to vanish entirely. And the wolf continued its effort, adjusting its grip, repositioning its stance, learning with each attempt how to move something fragile without breaking it, how to carry without truly carrying. And the storm resisted every step, the wind pushing against its body, the snow filling in the shallow trail behind them, erasing proof that either of them had ever been there. And still the wolf did not stop, because behind them the sound had changed. It was no longer distant, no longer uncertain, it had become immediate, a low, layered chorus moving through the storm with purpose, with direction. And the wolf knew that sound in a way deeper than thought. It knew what followed it, what it meant, what it would bring, and its movements sharpened, not faster but more precise, as it angled its path slightly, shifting away from open ground toward a line barely visible through the white, a cluster of dark shapes that broke the endless horizon, trees thin and distant but real. And the wolf pulled Margaret toward them step by step as the space between safety and exposure narrowed with every second, and the wind surged again, stronger now, cutting across the land in violent bursts that threatened to undo everything the wolf had gained. But it adjusted, lowering its body, shielding her partially from the worst of it, using its own form as a barrier against the cold that showed no mercy. And for a brief moment the trees seemed closer, almost within reach, a promise of something different, something less exposed. And then the ground beneath them shifted subtly, the surface breaking into uneven ridges of hardened snow and hidden ice, slowing progress, forcing the wolf to stop, to reposition, to pull from a different angle. And that delay mattered, because the sound behind them grew clearer, shapes forming within the storm, no longer just shadows but movement defined by direction, by intent, closing the distance with each passing second. And the wolf turned its head briefly, its eyes catching the faint outlines approaching through the white, not yet close enough to act but close enough to change everything. And in that instant the fragile balance of time collapsed into urgency, and the wolf made a choice not driven by instinct alone but by something far more complex, something that had formed in the quiet moments beside her, in the stillness where it had chosen not to leave. And it pulled again, harder, this time dragging her across the uneven ground toward the trees as the storm howled louder, as if resisting the very act unfolding within it. And Margaret's body shifted slightly, her hand brushing against the snow, her fingers twitching almost imperceptibly, as if responding to something beyond the cold, beyond the exhaustion. And the wolf did not notice, not fully, because its focus had narrowed to one singular path forward, one narrow chance to move her out of the open before the approaching presence. closed in completely, and the distance to the trees shrank slowly, painfully, each step contested by the environment, by the weight of what it carried, and by the growing pressure of what followed behind them. And just as the first branches began to take shape through the storm, the ground beneath Margaret gave way slightly, dipping into a shallow hollow hidden beneath the snow, and her body slid downward, pulling free from the wolf's grip for a brief second, breaking the fragile connection that had held them together. And the wolf stepped forward immediately, its body tense, its breath visible in sharp bursts as it moved to close that gap again. But the moment had already shifted, the delay already taken its cost, because behind them the shapes were no longer distant, they were near, and whatever choice had been made could no longer be undone. The moment her body slipped into the shallow hollow, the fragile rhythm they had built shattered completely, and the wolf reacted, instantly stepping forward into the depression without hesitation, its paws sinking slightly into the softer layer beneath the crust of ice as it lowered its head, searching for the edge of her coat again. But the angle had changed, the ground no longer flat, no longer cooperative, and for a fraction of time too small to measure, everything slowed: the wind, the sound behind them, the movement of snow across the surface, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see what the wolf would do next. And Margaret Hale lay deeper now, partially shielded by the dip in the earth, her form less exposed but also harder to move, her body settling into a position that resisted being pulled forward. And the wolf nudged at her again, more urgently. This time its movements no longer cautious but driven by the narrowing space between them and what approached, and behind them the storm parted just enough for shapes to emerge clearer than before, silhouettes cutting through the white, advancing not blindly but with direction, their presence no longer a distant threat but something immediate, something that would arrive within moments. And the wolf shifted again, repositioning itself higher on the edge of the hollow, bracing its legs against the uneven ground before gripping the fabric near her shoulder and pulling with a force that strained against the resistance beneath her. And for a second nothing happened. The snow held her, the earth refused to release what it had begun to claim, and then slowly her body moved, rising slightly, breaking free from the shallow trap inch by inch as the wolf leaned back, using its full weight to drag her upward and out. And the effort showed in every movement, the precision replaced by urgency, the careful balance replaced by a singular focus that left no room for hesitation. And as her body cleared the hollow, the wolf did not pause, it did not adjust, it pulled again, immediately dragging her across the uneven surface toward the line of trees that now stood closer, darker, more defined against the storm. And Margaret's head shifted slightly with the motion, her cheek brushing against the cold surface, her breath catching faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if something deep within her refused to let go entirely. And the wolf pressed forward, its body low, its movement steady despite the growing pressure behind them. And then the sound changed again, not louder but closer, layered now with the subtle crunch of movement against snow that did not belong to wind alone. And the wolf's ears flicked back, its awareness splitting between what it carried and what followed. But it did not turn, it did not look, because to look would be to slow, and to slow would be to lose the narrow advantage it still held. And the trees loomed nearer now, their branches cutting the wind, their shadows offering the first break in the endless exposure. And the wolf angled toward them, pushing harder, pulling faster, as the space between safety and pursuit collapsed into a single fragile line. And just as they reached the outer edge of the trees, where the wind weakened slightly, where the ground shifted beneath a thin layer of cover, the wolf felt it, a vibration through the snow, a presence no longer behind but near enough to change the air itself. And for the first time since it had chosen this path, it stopped, not out of fear but out of necessity, its body turning, partially shielding Margaret as it faced the direction they had come from, its breath steady, its stance fixed between retreat and confrontation. And the moment stretched thin, fragile, balanced on a decision that could not be undone. As the storm closed in around them and the space between hunter and protector dissolved into something far more uncertain, the storm tightened around them as if the world itself had closed its grip, and the trees that once promised shelter now felt thin, fragile, barely enough to break the force pressing in from every direction. And the wolf stood still for a single breath, its body positioned between Margaret Hale and the unseen shapes beyond the white, its chest rising slowly, its ears fixed, its entire form transformed from motion into presence. And behind that stillness something deeper settled, not fear, not hesitation, but a decision that had already been made and could not be reversed. And the sound came again, closer now, not carried by the wind but moving through it, deliberate, layered, multiple rhythms merging into one. And the space between moments grew smaller as the wolf shifted its weight slightly, adjusting its stance, not forward, not backward, but rooted, as if the ground itself held it in place. And Margaret lay behind it, barely visible against the snow, her form softened by frost, her breath so faint it nearly disappeared into the cold. And yet there was a difference now, something subtle, something fragile. Her fingers curled slightly into the fabric beneath them, as if responding to the presence in front of her, as if somewhere beneath the stillness her body recognized that it had not been left entirely alone. And the wolf sensed it, not through sight, not through sound, but through the shift in the air, the faint change in what had almost been lost, and it held its position longer than instinct would allow, longer than survival would justify. As the shapes beyond the trees began to take form, outlines moving through the storm, their movement no longer distant, no longer uncertain, and the wolf's body tense, not in preparation to strike but in readiness to hold, to endure, to stand in a place where it did not belong, because this was not territory, this was not a hunt, this was something else, something that had no pattern, no memory, no rule to follow. And the wind surged again, bending the thin branches above them, scattering snow across the ground, erasing tracks, blending forms, until the world reduced itself to motion and shadow and breath. And in that narrowing space the wolf stepped forward, not away from Margaret but slightly ahead of her, placing itself directly between her and what approached, closing the final distance that separated protector from threat. And the movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. Because it was no longer reacting, it was choosing, and the sound broke through the storm clearly now, a presence just beyond the veil of trees, just beyond the thin line of cover that separated them from the open. And the wolf did not retreat, it did not call, it did not signal, it simply stood, its body aligned with the path that led directly to her, as if drawing a boundary that could not be seen but would not be crossed. And time stretched in that moment longer than it should have, longer than the storm would allow, as if even the wilderness itself paused to witness what had formed within it. And then the shapes emerged, closer, now defined enough to be real, yet still hidden enough to remain uncertain. And the wolf's breath steadied, its body unwavering, its presence absolute, as it held its ground, not because it believed it could stop what was coming but because it had chosen not to leave. And behind it Margaret's breath caught slightly deeper, this time a fragile signal that life had not yet fully released its hold. And the storm roared louder, as if rejecting the stillness, as if trying to break what had formed between them, and yet neither moved, neither yielded. And the space between them and the approaching presence collapsed into a single fragile line where everything balanced on what would happen next. And the wolf did not look back, it did not reconsider, it remained exactly where it stood, because whatever came through that storm would have to pass through it first. The moment stretched beyond what the world should allow, as the storm pressed in from every side and the thin line of trees trembled under the force of the wind. But the wolf did not move, it held its place with a stillness that felt heavier than motion, as if the air itself had thickened around it. And the shapes beyond the white resolved further, no longer just shadows but forms with intention, with direction, with a presence that carried through the frozen ground and into the space between breaths. And Margaret Hale lay behind the wolf, her body still but no longer entirely absent, her chest rising slightly deeper than before, each breath fragile but present, as if pulled back by something she could not see. And the wolf sensed that shift, the faint return of life behind it, and something within its posture changed, not outwardly, not in a way the storm could notice, but internally, a tightening, a resolve that anchored it more firmly than instinct ever had. And the approaching presence slowed, not stopping but adjusting, as if recognizing the boundary that had been drawn, not in the snow, not in scent, but in the space the wolf occupied. And the wind surged again, scattering ice across the ground, blurring edges, distorting shapes, until everything became movement and noise and cold and still. The wolf stepped forward just once, not a retreat, not an attack, but a declaration, closing the last fragile gap between itself and the unseen force beyond. And in that movement something shifted in the balance of the moment, something that could not be measured but could be felt, as the presence beyond hesitated, not long, not fully, but enough for time to fracture into something uncertain. And the wolf held its ground, its breath steady, its body aligned with a purpose that had no origin in survival. And behind it Margaret's fingers moved again, slightly curling into the snow, as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp, as if the world had not fully released her yet. And the storm roared louder, as though rejecting the stillness that had formed between predator and protector, and the space filled with tension that had no sound, no visible form, but pressed against everything equally. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shapes beyond the storm shifted their movement, altering direction, not retreating, not advancing, but circling just beyond the thin barrier of trees, as if testing the limits of what stood before them, as if waiting for a break that did not come. And the wolf did not follow, it did not track their movement, it remained exactly where it stood, its focus fixed forward, its presence unbroken. And the moment held suspended longer than it should have, until the storm itself seemed to swallow the shapes again, pulling them back into the white, until their outlines faded, their sound diminished, their presence dissolved into distance once more. And yet the danger did not vanish, it lingered just beyond sight, just beyond sound. A reminder that this fragile safety was temporary, that the line the wolf had drawn could not hold forever. And as the tension slowly released from the air, the wolf remained still for a moment longer, as if confirming what could not be seen. And then it turned its head slightly, not away from the storm but toward Margaret Hale behind it. And for the first time since it had chosen to stay, it stepped back, closing the distance between them once more, lowering itself beside her, its body pressing gently against hers, sharing what warmth remained as the wind continued to howl and the trees bent under its force, and Margaret's breath deepened again, barely but enough, a fragile rhythm returning against all logic, against all expectation, and the storm closed in tighter around them as if unwilling to accept what had just occurred, and the wolf settled into place, its presence no longer just protection but something else, something that had no name in the wild, and as the world beyond remained uncertain as the threat lingered unseen, the fragile connection between them held stronger than before. But the night was far from over, and the storm had not yet finished what it had begun. The storm did not ease, it only changed its rhythm as the night stretched deeper, and the fragile pocket of stillness beneath the trees became a temporary illusion rather than true shelter, and the wolf remained pressed against Margaret Hale, its body steady, its warmth constant, even as the cold tried to reclaim everything it touched, and time began to blur, not into hours but into breaths, each one uncertain, each one fragile, as if the space between them could collapse at any moment, and Margaret drifted somewhere between awareness and silence, her thoughts no longer clear but no longer gone either, faint images rising and falling, a door, a voice, a memory that refused to fully disappear, and with each shallow breath her body answered in the smallest ways, a slight movement in her hand, a faint tightening of her shoulders, as if something within her was resisting the pull of the cold, not through strength but through persistence, and the wolf felt it, the subtle change in her presence, the difference between something fading and something holding on, and it adjusted again, pressing closer, curling its body around hers more completely, shielding her from the wind that slipped between the trees in sharp cutting bursts, and beyond that narrow space the storm continued to move, reshaping the land, erasing every path that had led them here, and somewhere in the distance the sound returned, not as strong, not as immediate, but present enough to remind that the danger had not left, it had only shifted, waiting for another moment to press forward again. And the wolf lifted its head briefly, its ears turning toward the darkness beyond the trees, its awareness stretching outward, measuring distance, measuring time, before lowering itself again, refusing to leave the position it had chosen. And the night deepened further, the sky above unseen, the world reduced to cold and breath, and the faint rhythm of two lives existing side by side against something that should have ended one of them long ago. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed, not in the storm, not in the cold, but in the space between them, as Margaret's breathing steadied just enough to form a pattern, fragile but real, a quiet defiance against the silence that had nearly taken her. And the wolf shifted slightly, responding to that change, its body relaxing by a fraction, its posture no longer only defensive but sustaining, as if it understood in some instinctive way that survival now depended not on movement but on endurance, on holding this fragile balance long enough for something beyond the storm to intervene. And the wind howled louder again, as if resisting the idea that anything could survive within it, and the trees bent under the force, their branches creaking, their shapes bending against the pressure, and still the small space beneath them held, not safe, not secure, but enough. And the wolf remained, its presence unwavering, its body forming a barrier that the cold could not fully cross. And Margaret's fingers moved again, more clearly this time, curling slightly against the fabric beneath them, as if reaching toward warmth, as if responding to the presence that refused to leave her behind. And the moment stretched longer than it should have, longer than the storm allowed, as if time itself had slowed around them. And then far beyond the trees, beyond the shifting white and the endless horizon, something new entered the world, not loud, not immediate, but different, a faint glow breaking through the storm, distant and uncertain at first, but real enough to exist. And the wolf lifted its head again, its eyes turning toward that direction, its body still but alert, as the glow flickered once, then again barely visible through the storm, and Margaret's breath caught slightly deeper, as if her body sensed something her mind could not yet reach. And the fragile balance between them shifted once more, not toward danger, not yet, but toward something unknown, something that could change everything. And the night held its breath as the faint light flickered in the distance, and the question that had followed them through the storm remained unanswered as to whether this was the beginning of survival